their decision-making processes. To what extent are BRICS evolving from an economic alliance to an alternative geostrategic alliance?
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This session will begin immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This session will begin immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, Global Affairs Analyst at CNN, Kimberly Dozier.
Thank you. Thank you. Honored to be here to lead this discussion on the enlargement of NATO and BRICS, just possibly. And joining me is Jorge Castañeda, Global Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at New York University and former Minister of Foreign Relations of Mexico. And also we have Alessandro Minuto Rizzo, President of the NATO Defense College and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO. So I thought I'd start, especially as we've discussed about the nature of disinformation and influence campaigns. A lot of those campaigns have centered on describing what NATO or BRICS are or are not. And so I'm just going to quickly run through, not so much for the purposes of the audience in the room, since a lot of you are foreign policy practitioners, but for those watching. NATO, created in 1949 for collective security after World War II. The alliance added Greece and Turkey shortly afterward, according to the NATO website, quote, at a time when there was a fear of communist expansion throughout Europe and other parts of the world, for example, Soviet support of the North Korean invasion of South Korea in 1950. Now, as for its enlargement, Article 10 of the NATO treaty says membership is open to, quote, any European state in a position to further the principles of this treaty and to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. So NATO right now has 31 allies, the latest being Finland. Sweden has submitted its paperwork to join, pending the Turkish parliament's approval, meaning the Turkish leader who's blaming the Turkish parliament, but that's another issue. Ukraine applied for NATO membership in 2022 after Russia proclaimed the annexation of its territory. And 2 other states have also applied, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia. So any decision to add in a new member has to be approved by all the current members of NATO. So now we move to what is BRICS. It was founded in 2009 by Brazil, Russia, India, and China. South Africa was added in 2010. And at the first BRICS summit in Yekaterinburg, members set forth the goals as promoting dialogue and cooperation among our countries in an incremental, proactive, pragmatic, open, and transparent way. And they added later that they would behave in a, quote, non-block nature with, quote, neutrality with regard to third parties, unquote. So far, 40 countries have expressed interest in joining BRICS. And the 5-nation bloc announced that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and the UAE would join the group starting in 2024. So with the addition of those 6 countries, BRICS would now represent 42% of the world's population and 36% of global GDP. So, gentlemen, I'm going to start with a provocative and very American question. Who's winning, BRICS or NATO?
Well, we're not fighting, so
Alhamdulillah.
Not clear who's winning.
In the popularity contest, then. the
Right
global.
now, I think in the popularity contest, BRICS is winning because the so-called global South loves BRICS. Now, I'm from Mexico, which is one of the countries that is not one of the 40 that has expressed interest. Alhamdulillah. I'm glad we didn't. The last thing I would want for my country is to get together with a bunch of thugs like BRICS. I don't know who is worse. I've got trouble figuring out who's the worst of the four.
Could you get off the
Lula's
fence?
a decent guy, but you know, hanging out with Modi, with Xi, with Putin, and even with Ramaphosa and his sofa, no. I'd rather not hang out with them, not to mention the Saudis, the UAE, and the Iranians. I'm glad Mexico was not invited, and I'm glad Mexico did not lobby to be invited.
And I see that in August, the president of Mexico went on record and said that they do not want to be part of BRICS.
Practically the only thing he and I agree upon.
Okay, so what do you, sir, think?
Well, you know, you speak about membership. NATO is a special kind of animal, if you like, because it started in 1949, only 12 countries. Now it's 32. I had about, I think, 8 kind of enlargements, you know. And you wonder, you know, if this all is going to help the organization or not. In a sense, it reinforces the organization, because the more you are, the more you feel you're stronger in a way. But on the other hand, you lose a little bit identity, because, you know, you have different people who have different views of the world, different strategies, they have different priorities, different histories. If you take NATO, of course, you have Canada and United States in North America, and you have the others in Europe. But of course, Portugal has a different view than Estonia, and Italy than Latvia, perhaps. So it makes, it makes difficult to manage the reality of a larger organization. On the other side, I mean, if you like, on the positive side, you have only, if I may say so, good democracies, more or less. So it simplifies on the other side, but it's a very complex thing, very complex.
In that you get into the EU dilemma, the dilemma that NATO is facing right now. All the members except for Turkey want Sweden to be fully brought in, and so one holdout means the whole thing is frozen.
Well, you know, you have also to keep, I mean, you know, I don't think it's not boring, you know, but you have to say a few fundamental things. NATO is not an international organization in the traditional sense. It's an alliance. Everybody, including ourselves, we forget that. It's an alliance. So there is no vote. Nobody votes in NATO, because in an alliance you don't vote. It's by consensus, you know. It means that you have to agree, you know, in different ways to do certain things. And it happens. But of course, I mean, this is a process that implies also, how can I say, what kind of objective you want to have. Because very often NATO is presented as a military organization, boots on the ground, a soldier with a rifle, you know, that the idea that many people have. And in some countries of the world, you know, NATO is seen some, you know, people bombed, you know, by NATO aircraft. But all this is not true, because it's a political organization, first of all. A political organization, as the treaty says. It is also not true, because this is another thing which is often say that the Americans are ruling it. No, it's not true. Yes, of course, is the most important member. But for instance, it was never in the Iraq war or many other things. So it is really rather serious. So now, there is a general tendency, I think, in the world to enlarge the membership, which is a different, more, I don't know, political.
Bigger is better. Bigger is always better.
You know, the BRICS, you know, said they are enlarging apparently. The European Union wants to enlarge. Everybody wants to enlarge. NATO has, United Nations, more than 200 members, so everybody wants to enlarge. It's probably because of the fact that, you know, up to the Second World War, 1960 or so, in fact, you had only a few powers, you know, and in the Northern Hemisphere. Now there are so many actors in the world, or people and countries want their voice to be heard. And so it's natural that there are aggregations of all kinds. It doesn't mean that the world is more secure than before.
But with Article 5 and its use, its one-time use after the attacks of 9/11, the U.S. called on all its NATO allies, and lo and behold, we had war in Afghanistan that lasted for 20 years. And so most people growing up with that running in the background think of NATO as a military alliance. And isn't that correct?
Well, it is in the sense that, for example, the BRICS clearly are not. In other words, these are two very different types of groupings. I wouldn't call them organizations. NATO has a founding treaty, has an Article 5, has a common budget, has a huge headquarters in Brussels, has a history now of well over half a century. It's a military and political organization which has served its function over the years.
And it's carried out operations together.
It has carried out operations in Afghanistan and in other places, and will probably do it again at some point somewhere. We'll see where. BRICS originally was a turn of phrase, sort of a brilliant idea, or at least mediatic idea, that Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs had back in 2005. That's where it comes from.
Well, the BRICS website says it was Russia's idea.
Yeah, well, the Russians like to say those things. Everything is their idea, according to them. But in fact, this was coined by Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs. He put the 4 countries together, not the 5, saying these were the emerging economies that were doing very well, and this was in 2005, and that by 2020-something, they would be X, Y, and Z. Most of that did not happen, but the acronym stuck. And then they began to try to get together. And what they have done, the only thing they've really created, which is not unimportant, is the BRICS Bank, located in Shanghai, and now presided over by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. The question here really, the interesting thing, and this has to do with enlargement, but it has a deeper meaning for the so-called Global South, which is also a term I don't like, but is if it's anti-bloc, which as you read in the statement, if that's true, we have a problem. The problem is that in principle there are 2 blocs in today's world, or 2 rival powers, China and the United States. But China is part of BRICS, so how can BRICS have China but be anti-blocs?
Again, I read that off their website. This is not what USIP describes it as.
No.
They describe it as a counter, the U.S. Institute for Peace, one of the places that I was pulsing for information, and they describe it as an organization that was set up to counter Western institutions, Western-led hegemony, et cetera.
Absolutely. I think that makes more sense. But then it is not either anti-bloc or not even necessarily Global South, and certainly not a new incarnation with its enlargement for example, the non-aligned movement of countries that was founded back in the 50s by Tito and Nasser and Sukarno and Nehru. No, because BRICS has a congenital attachment, like Siamese twins, with China. There is China, and then there's the other guys.
Yeah.
In the case of India, the population is the same, but the military and economic potential is totally not comparable. So this is a group of countries that have, in a sense, evolved around China. Now, you can like that and think that's a good thing, or not like it, but that is what it is. It's very difficult to think of, let's say, the United Arab Emirates, now if they were to join. What kind of symmetry or equality is there between them and China? None whatsoever. This is a first problem. The second problem with the enlargement that they're already facing is, first of all, some of the guys don't want to join. The new president of Argentina said before he was elected that thanks but no thanks, and he probably will confirm this, though he's been fuzzy about it, but he probably will. So then the next question becomes, what kind of people do you want to enlarge to? NATO has criteria. They may, on occasion, they're a bit hypocritical. The European Union has criteria. They also may be a bit hypocritical. But when you invite the 6 that you mentioned, it's hard to say what is the logic there except some kind of regional balance. And again, that balance is very arguable.
Well, but you know, I think in NATO there is a logic. In fact, I draw from what you are saying. There is a logic because your question was about Article 5 and that. In fact, you know, if you go down to realities, you know, beside these big scenarios, for instance, I asked a former Prime Minister of Sweden that I met in a conference, you know, why did Sweden apply for NATO membership? Because they had been neutral for hundreds of years, and they were partners of NATO, but never thought about joining, you know. And I remember when I was in NATO, they were partners, they came there, but they were not thinking about membership.
They had the official partner status, which is an official
it is very
step.
important because, you know, this former Prime Minister, I don't say the name, he said, well, you know, we thought we were right before, but then after Putin attacked Ukraine, the public opinion in my country thought it is better to ask for membership. You're more secure in a way, you know. You go to a group, you know, and you are defended by that group. So, you know, you never know. Better to be that side, you know. It's more secure for my country. It's
Now,
interesting.
Ukraine has been a galvanizing force in terms of NATO, in that I remember talking to a NATO ambassador who shall remain nameless to a foreign country that shall remain nameless. But they were griping that when they went to Washington, D.C., nobody really wanted to see them. This was obviously several years ago, because they thought NATO was a dying organization that had no purpose. And then came Crimea, and then came the most recent Russian invasion, continuation of the Crimea attack. And all of a sudden, everywhere I went across Europe, I heard fear. I heard people who had sounded paranoid to me before lay out their logic and say, this is why Moscow's coming for us next. So are they right to be afraid, or do you think otherwise?
You're speaking about Ukraine.
I'm speaking about the Baltic countries, Sweden,
well, you know,
Finland.
there are two different issues. The Balkan countries, you know, and
No, Baltic.
Oh, beyond
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Well, the Baltic countries, of course, they became independent and they immediately asked for NATO membership because, of course, they felt much more secure rather than to be a Soviet republic. It was a much more comfortable situation for them. You can understand that, you know. Ukraine is a different story. It's a different and complicated story because the Ukraine became independent in 1991 when Gorbachev dissolved the Soviet Union, and out of one you have 15 countries. And in fact, they never asked for membership in NATO, you know. There is never been a formal application from Ukraine to become a NATO member.
Until they got invaded.
What only happened, just to be, you know, on the record, if you like, in the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, in this final communique, it says that Ukraine one day will become a NATO member, and that's all. And it was never repeated afterwards. So in fact, what I think is that the Russian aggression to Ukraine is not really about NATO, because this is...
But from the Russian perspective, Moscow brings up that one little line and says that's a sign that the US was trying to encroach through NATO on Russian borders because Ukraine is a neighbor. And that they use that as an excuse to invade.
Well, you know, what can I say? No, there is an ongoing story, you know, on the fact that NATO has provoked Russia. Let's put it that way, you know, and it is something which is, you know, said by many people around the world. But if you go into what is written in the treaties and what is really on the record, you know, and I refer to the NATO-Russia Founding Act, 1997. The date is interesting because it's when those countries were already negotiating their entry into NATO. I mean, the Eastern European countries. In this act, it is said that nuclear weapons NATO will never be stationed in those new countries. First thing, you know, nuclear. It is said 3 times, and also it says that all the members of NATO, just to understand each other, so Germany, Italy, United States, etc., would not put substantial troops in the new countries, you know. which means that in Poland you had Polish forces, at all. So no threat to Russia at all. It's only after the 2014, when Crimea was occupied, then, of course, some reaction started and a few troops were stationed in those countries.
There's a famous claim by the Russians that one of the last meetings between Secretary of State Jim Baker and Gorbachev, this must have been in '91, that Baker committed himself on behalf of the United States and President Bush 41 that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO. And then the 2008 declaration in Bucharest seemed to contradict that. Gorbachev, before he died on several occasions, waffled on the issue. He's never said in a categorical way whether Baker actually said that or didn't. And Baker, who's still alive and quite lucid, has said that he didn't say it. The Russians insist that they have. So you have there an ambiguous situation, which I think probably people as intelligent, as sophisticated as Baker and subsequently Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, who were Bush 43's two secretaries of state, preferred to leave this in that ambiguous state. They probably were right in doing so. I want to come back a little bit to my BRICS on two aspects. The first is that the difficulties of the congenital difficulties of a grouping like this have become increasingly apparent aside from the enlargement. For example, at the South African summit in the summer, a lot of people, particularly in the media, got very excited because Lula had made a couple of comments to in the sense that he wanted some kind of common currency and a certain number of transactions between Russia and China, Brazil and Argentina, who was going to be asked, et cetera, were being done in their own currencies, or in any case, not the dollar. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, once they actually met and started working on this, nothing happened. And in our, I won't say lifetime, but let's say between now and the next Marrakesh meeting of the Atlantic Dialogues, it won't happen. There will be no BRIC currency. And similarly, there will be, with great difficulty, any common BRIC stance on conflicts that erupt. Gaza, Palestine, et cetera, is a relatively easy one for them. But for example, Ukraine wasn't, because India has not been willing to take a clear-cut, 100% supportive stance of Russia. Yeah. It has abstained at the Security Council and has consistently wanted to remain more or less neutral, supposedly because it wants to conserve the possibility of being a mediator. Brazil is complicated about this stuff because they like the Russians, they buy fertilizer from the Russians, et cetera, but they don't like the idea of one country invading another. And so they are much more ambiguous. So you're not going to find Brazil and India lining up with Russia, China, and South Africa on Ukraine. And as the time goes by, you will find it more and more difficult for these five, plus the additional six, let's say the additional five, to have a common stance on anything.
And yet, supporters of Russia, supporters of China, point out that since the Ukraine invasion and this initial sort of euphoric rallying of a US-led coalition, as the war has worn on, it's been pointed out that no members of the Global South have sanctioned Russia over Ukraine at last count. Almost no members of Asia. So then you see the BRICS meeting and an announced expansion with many more countries wanting to join, and you have to ask, are we seeing a new axis of the East versus axis of the West? The haves versus the largely have-nots, if you're looking at per capita GDP, et cetera?
Well, if you ask me this question, I go back to history of my generation. We had the non-aligned movement, you remember that, Tito, Sukarno, and other countries, and they were putting forward problems of the South, let's put it in a general way, and certain issues, contrary to what it was fought in the Northern Hemisphere by the so-called great power of the times, etc., etc. So I see largely a repetition of that. And I see on the press a lot of criticism on the West, if you like, in the sense that some people say, well, look, you know, as perhaps part of your question, there are so many countries in the world that are not interested in the sanctions against Russia, and they don't care about that. But I don't take that to be a pro-Russian attitude. I take only that to be looking at the self-interest of the country concerned, maybe Uruguay or Zambia, and they don't see why they should take responsibilities in sanctioning a country they have perhaps never seen in their life, or they have no connection, etc. So
it's more like an abstention than a vote for.
You know, for the OPEC decision, you know, to raise prices of oil a few months ago, I remember the Saudis, some Saudi responsible person saying, you know, this is not against NATO or against the United States or the European Union. It's just in our self-interest, you know. If you raise the price, you get more money. You know, that's all.
I'm going to pivot to questions in a moment. We are only going to have time for a couple, but we'll do that in the last 10 minutes. But
have and have-nots against this is the ambiguity, the contradictory nature of groups like BRICS, or even, as I said, the very notion of a global South. China as a have-not nation is kind of difficult for me to get my arms around it.
Yeah.
I don't see the world's factory.
But they are still classed as a developing nation.
They class themselves as a developing nation. That's their privilege. They can class themselves.
Ability to lead NATO and continue to rally international support for its causes. And will what's going on in Gaza fuel further additions to BRICS?
You're speaking about a possible Israel application to NATO? No?
No.
What are you thinking about?
No, I am not speaking about a possible Israel application to NATO. The U.S. has taken a lot of grief over how it's embraced Israel during this crisis and continued to allow weapon sales, even as President Biden himself has spoken of the Israelis using, I think his words were indiscriminate force.
Here we are going to a very different area of problems, you know, which are very, very, very different from the one we were touching upon before. But what I saw, I mean, as an analyst again, you know, in the recent years, a recomposition of the Arab region, which went very fragmented at a certain point, you know, with every country having its own policy, and even the Gulf Cooperation Council having Qatar against Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. All this has changed a little bit, and we saw in recent years a recomposition where these quarrels were at least formally composed. Now, of course, with the existing situation in Gaza, it is very difficult to predict the future. Personally, I don't, I may be wrong, of course, I don't see a change in Israeli policy, an important one. I see the same continuation, more or less. I think that the Abraham agreements will be frozen, at least, for, let's put it that way, you know, for a number of years. So reasons for those agreements remain, but of course the situation is such that I don't think that it is possible to put them into practice. So we are looking at a situation of high tension in the air, I think, for the next few years.
And for the mic runners, we have one question there, and just a second. One question back there. While you get the question, what do you think it's done to? Is the U.S. reputation damaged such that it's going to give power to the Southern
I thought
coalition?
I was going to get away without answering that,
Yeah,
but
sorry.
I didn't. I think that this has damaged the United States' reputation enormously because while the initial support, clear, concrete, and unconditional support for Israel was understandable in the United States and many parts of the world because of the atrocity of the Hamas attack, every day that goes by with the Israeli bombardment and attacks in Gaza and the hostages remaining and not being rescued, etc., does an enormous amount of damage to Israel and consequently to the United States support. But what worries me most, beyond, of course, the tragic element of the deaths in Gaza and in southern Israel, is that this could lead to Biden's defeat in next November's elections and to Trump's re-election in next November's election. And I can't think of anything worse that could happen to the world, and certainly not to Mexico, than Trump being re-elected. So that's what really, really worries me.
And as we just have 5 minutes left, please make sure there is actually a question in your question, no statements. I think we're one here, and then if you could give your mic to her and that one person back there. So we're going to take 3 quick questions.
Policy Center for the New South, very quick. The BRICS represent 46% of the global population. BRICS expanded. 46% of the global population, 43% of all export, 29% of global GDP, and more than 25% of global export. So instead of being dismissive of its potential impact, is it possible to assess what if the BRICS act as one and effectively? What could be the consequences, and how should NATO or other players react? Thank you so much.
Oh, she has one. Yeah, like a new G7.
Thank you so very much. I think the mic is on. Just to follow on my colleague's question, I was struck by the dismissive nature of your early comments. And if the BRICS are...
My dismissive comments?
No, mine. I own that.
If it is that you can come here and dismiss leaders, global leaders, as a bunch of thugs, why is it that they are so important that they can't be ignored? Why are they being invited to the G7? Why is Modi's visit to the United States, to Washington, D.C., that elevated to a state visit? Why is it that we can't accept that these countries are not just being neutral, not taking a stand, but that they are multi-aligned?
We're going to have to leave it there.
And the last question that I have to say, how can we, in a forum such as this, in Africa, call an African leader a thug?
Make it fast, like
different.
20 seconds.
He's got the sofa.
No, mine is easy.
The sofa man.
No, it's easy to understand. I think that BRICS didn't invite Mexico because it would save Mexico the embarrassment to ask permission to the U.S. to join. But that's the point. Now, what I wanted to say this, next time, it's interesting if we compare BRICS to G7, there's nothing to do with NATO. They are not the same organization, not the same scope. And I think, if you want to know how the future goes, you should start studying a little bit more about BRICS and what the purpose is in the long run. This is all about what we learned today. But thank you very much.
And our last one in the corner.
Du Policy Center. Je crois que
well, this comparison between the two extensions on the one hand of NATO and BRICS is not timely necessarily or opportunistic. I think, yes, both groups are enlarging in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine, and the other phenomena is occurring because of the enlargement of the global to be made. If there is a comparison to be made, is between the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation, and other organizations. So, vous avez...
I cannot interfere with the coffee break, so take your pick.
Well, I'll go first since I was directly concerned. Yeah, except I see no possibility that they will ever act as one. So I don't think it's worthwhile speculating about what would happen if. I don't think so. It won't happen, at least not in my lifetime, perhaps in yours, but I don't particularly like to speculate about things that are not going to happen. Dismissive, yes, absolutely dismissive. And no, yes, I do think that Xi Jinping is a thug. I think that Putin is a thug. I think that Modi is increasingly a thug. I specifically said Lula was not. And Ramaphosa, I don't know exactly where to put him after all the corruption accusations. We can perhaps talk about that. But Xi, Modi, and Putin, yes, thugs, absolutely. I have no doubt about it.
Oh, dear.
Well,
Sir.
what I can say, just to is that I don't think that we're going to see in the future the North against the South or vice versa. Because today we are speaking about NATO, which is a special kind of organization, and the BRICS, which is a special in its own way. But we have not spoken about the G20, for instance, which is another thing where you had the North and the South which are mixed, you know. A good example, if you want a cooperation, I understand the African Union applied to the G20 recently. So I think that we can be a little perhaps more optimistic than we started in the end, you know, and thinking that, you know, the possibility of cooperation exists and they are there and we have all the interest to take them.
Ending on an optimistic note, thank you all very much. Please go for coffee.
Thank you.
Sure.
He wanted it to be exciting.
Atlantic Dialogues Conference,
Ladies and
annual
gentlemen,
high-level
we will
gathering
now
of
take a
influential
coffee
public and
break
private sector
and get
leaders
back to the
from around the
ballroom
Atlantic
at
Basin for
5:05
open,
p.m.
candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, A More Assertive Atlantic, Its Meaning for the World. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website, atlanticdialogues.org. Under the high patronage of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin, for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 400 high-level participants will gather from more than 80 countries to delve into this year's theme, A More Assertive Atlantic, Its Meaning for the World. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 380 talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Marrakesh for off-the-record, frank, and uninhibited discussions. South-South cooperation, the future of multilateralism, international financial architecture, economic nationalism, democracy in crisis, technology for sustainable transition, BRICS and NATO enlargements, global governance, and education. Over 40 emerging leaders from across the Atlantic, selected from thousands of applicants, will join the conference after a 3-day tailor-made leadership and networking program. To know more, visit our dedicated website,